I'm going to talk about reader-oriented criticism, specifically as a response to new criticism. It wasn't so much a response to Russian formalism, in part because Russian formalism took so long to get out of the country and published and read that it really hadn't become a factor the way new criticism had. New criticism had become the way to read poems. There are a lot of different kinds of reader-oriented critics, but the ones who are responding directly to new criticism became most powerful in the 50s, 60s, even 70s. I will point out that Louise Rosenblatt was writing all of these things in the 1930s, but we don't pay attention to her because she's a woman. Nevertheless, her idea is probably the best one to start with when we talk about reader-oriented criticism. She and the rest of the reader-oriented critics are less interested in undermining the intentional fallacy, but more interested in undermining what the new critics called the effective fallacy. So if you recall, the effective fallacy is the idea that the way I read a poem doesn't change the meaning of the poem, that I might be reading it wrong. So the example I used in class was like, if the dishwasher manual is secretly about how my girlfriend or boyfriend left me, then I'm just reading that manual wrong. That's the effective fallacy. The reader-oriented critics want to say, yeah, okay, but there is a lot of what you're calling the affect affecting your reading of the poem, new critics. For example, you're assuming that everyone went to the same schools and learned exactly how to read the poems the way you do, that everyone interprets it the way you do, and that you get to decide the real meaning of the poem. And those meanings are the ones that strike you. They might not strike other people, and that in and of itself doesn't make other people's readings wrong or worse. It just makes them different from yours. This undermining of the effective fallacy is at the heart of what the reader-oriented critics want to say. There are a lot of different ways in which reader-oriented critics play this up. One of them is thinking about, as Louise Rosenblatt does, the reader and the poem the reader and the text coming together to make a poem. That you need the words on the page, but then you also need someone who's interpreting them as meaningful in order to shape the poem, or rather to even create the poem. And later reader-oriented critics would say other kinds of versions of that, would say versions of things like structural or subjective, phenomenological kinds of reader-oriented theories. Phenomenological critics would say that what we want to do is trace the way a reader might respond to the lines in the poem as they come up. The reader is going to move from one line in a poem to another line in a poem, and we need to pay attention to how that move works. It's not just true that the poem exists, it's true that the reader works through it. It's also true, or interesting, or a strategy, that reader-oriented critics can look at a reader structurally. Who is this reader that the new critics don't like? Do they mean actual readers like me, Emily, sitting here reading a poem? Or do they mean an implied reader that the poem seems to, or the story seems to suggest as this imaginary reader? Or do you mean like the person who's listening to the narrator in a story? Like, what reader are you criticizing or attending to? And then you get into structuralist arguments about that. There's a third kind of reader-oriented criticism in your book that's called subjective reader-oriented criticism, and it's dumb. So you're welcome to read it, but we're not going to talk about it. We can talk about it for maybe 1 minute. And when I say dumb, I mean it's dumb, but I also mean people don't do it. So it's not as useful for us. All of these critics are trying to point out that my definition, or I'm sorry, my interpretation of a poem might be different from yours, but not wrong. It might be better supported by textual evidence or supported worse by textual evidence. And we might use that sort of basis to think about which interpretation is more useful or helpful or interesting. But that different kinds of readers are going to come up with different kinds of interpretations, and that's fine. Stanley Fish, whom we're reading next, is going to talk about interpretive communities. And what he means by that is that there are communities of readers who read things in similar ways. So if you're a new critic, Wimsatt and Beardsley, you read in a certain way. Other communities read in different ways, and those ways aren't worse, they're just different. Okay, so we'll talk about this more in class, and I think it actually answers a lot of the questions or confusions that came up in class last time, because it sort of explains how critics answered the same questions that you had. Okay.